Okay, world history students, we're going to finish up our study of Europe, basically for the year, by talking about the Renaissance. So after the nations of Europe became the nations of Europe, we have France and England. They'll continue that process, but they've really gotten started during the late Middle Ages. And we've had the Black Death and the Crusades that have caused massive destruction throughout the continent. Pretty bad, but all of that opens up Europe for a rebirth and a renewal of learning and culture, and that's the time period that we call the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and in history when we talk about the Renaissance, we mean a period of time from about 1350 to 1600. This movement, it's an intellectual movement. It begins in the city-states of Italy, which were centered on trading. Italy had always remained the closest of anyone in Europe to the classics, which makes sense, right? This was the Roman Empire's center. This was a center for trade and remained wealthy through much of the Middle Ages, and also remained close to the Byzantine Empire, which hadn't experienced the Dark Ages to the same extent that Europe did. During this time, a new idea emerges called humanism. This is a secular, remember secular means non-religious, and you should take a moment to write that down on your note sheet if that did not stick in your mind last week when we talked about it. It stressed worldly issues. So individualism, importance of the individual, and human improvement, so working on being the best version of yourself, were the big ideas behind humanism. So individualism is an idea that should be familiar to you because this is an idea that we live with, that people as individuals are important. They don't have to be part of a group, that we respect individual freedoms, individual choice, individual expression. So, now we are all our own wonderful little snowflakes. Everybody's different. Everyone is unique. This is individualism. During this time, education comes back to Europe. Secular education that stressed Latin, Greek, philosophy, and other humanities become very important. And there becomes a group of secular teachers. So instead of the priests, you go to a school where somebody who is a professional educator teaches you, if you're rich enough to afford it. We saw during the late Middle Ages the growth of towns. This continues to happen. In the towns, people are better fed, so the population increases. Any remnants of feudalism pretty much are disappearing. Trade is increasing with the Middle East, and cities like Florence and Rome and Venice become the birthplaces of rebirth in Europe, largely because of their trade connections. So here we have some of these places on our map. We've got Florence, we've got Venice, Genoa is another one. So Florence is a center of trade. After the Crusades, lots of luxury goods come to Europe through Florence, and the city gets really wealthy as a result. In Florence, there was a family called the de Medici family. They were a wealthy banking family, and they used their money to fund the arts in Florence, and this increases people's civil pride. They like being from there. They like being associated with the city. Rome remains the center of the Catholic Church and is very wealthy as a result of that connection. The church helps to rebuild Rome into a great city once again. The popes promoted artwork to beautify the city, and included in those programs is St. Peter's Basilica, which is the big church now that is associated with the Vatican in Rome. So here's St. Peter's. It's got this amazing square. You can go up on the roof up here. That's kind of neat. You can send a postcard from the roof of St. Peter's, if I remember correctly. Alright, then we have Venice. Venice is a trading city. It's on the eastern side of the Italian peninsula, and it provides a link between Europe and the East. It was a center for shipbuilding, so people would sail there from the Mediterranean, from all around. and it was known for art, literature, technological advances. Let's talk about art during this time. So one of the most important outcomes of the Renaissance is the art that was created. The Italian Renaissance art is focused on the individual. It's very lifelike. We see a new ability and appreciation for perspective and depth in art. Artists are learning to convey human emotions through facial expressions and body position. And this is another time period where, in addition to sculpture and painting, frescoes are quite popular. The architecture of the Renaissance returns to the big ideas of Greece and Rome. There's a lot of symmetry, there's a lot of columns and domes. Architects are as famous as artists during this time, and probably the most famous of those architects, as far as advancing architectural technology, is Brunelleschi, who advanced dome technology and used the principles of Roman arches to create bigger and bigger domes for churches. So we're going to turn forward in your notes to the page on the masters. We're going to look at these paintings. You need to label on your note sheet the name of the painter or the sculptor and the name of the work for each. It is important that you be able to recognize these paintings, know or recognize, at least if given a choice, their titles and who painted them. So this is the Mona Lisa. It is painted by Leonardo da Vinci. It was a painting he worked on over a long period of time. It's now in a museum in Paris. And she is famous for her enigmatic look. You don't really know what she's thinking. You can't really decipher her emotion, but it's not because of a lack of skill. It's because she's got this look in her eyes. And some people say that if you move around, that her eyes will follow you. So, feel free to get up and move yourself around your laptop, see if she follows you around. Then we have The Last Supper, which was also painted by Da Vinci. This is a huge painting. This painting would take up most of the long wall of our classroom. That is how big it is. And we have in the center, we have Jesus with the disciples. Okay, because this is Jesus's Last Supper. Much of this art, because it was paid for in large parts by the church, is religious art. You can tell here who's Judas because he's holding a bag of coins. Then we have the Sistine Chapel, which was painted by Michelangelo. This is a painting literally on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It took years to finish. And it's on the ceiling of a small chapel within St. Peter's. And all of these scenes are biblical scenes. And we'll look up close at this scene here, which is the creation of man. So we have God and Adam and the creation of man in this moment where their fingers reach out to touch Adam's creation. Also in St. Peter's, and this is if you go into the main part of the church is where this statue is. It's called La Pietà. And this is Jesus having been taken down from the cross, being held by Mary, his mother. I mean, look at the detail in the carving, guys. Look at the way you see the folds in the cloth, the expression in the position of their bodies, the way her hand presses into his flesh, the way your hand would, if you press it into somebody, their skin kind of gives way. So incredible realism. This is the David by Michelangelo, which is a bigger-than-life sculpture of David, as in David and Goliath. And if you think back to our classical art, we remember that we often see people leaning on tree stumps so that they don't fall over. He's also extremely realistic, except for his extra large hand right here, which needs to reach out and touch his leg so that the marble isn't too heavy and it doesn't fall off. Then we have the School of Athens, painted by the painter Raphael. This shows all of the most famous minds of ancient Greece meeting together in this imaginary meeting, and this painting is in the Vatican also. Here we have another very different sculpture of David from the Bible, right? David and Goliath, King David. And this is David looking much more like a Renaissance person, from his hat to the kind of armor that he has. Okay, we're going to go back to the first note sheet to look at some important authors and works. So Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, which is a story about young people telling stories to distract themselves from the plague. Machiavelli wrote The Prince, which is a guidebook for rulers. And Petrarch wrote poems that inspired Shakespeare. In the Northern Renaissance, things were a little bit different. The ideas worked their way up, but there was still a lot more focus on Christianity than there was in Italy. People learn about ideas from the Italian Renaissance in the North largely due to war, which is a great example of cultural diffusion. The other big way that these ideas get spread is by a guy named Gutenberg, who invented the printing press. The first book printed was the Bible, and it's called the Gutenberg Bible. As books become available, knowledge spreads. People get access to information and begin to question large institutions. In the Catholic Church, this leads to the Reformation, which you'll talk about at the beginning of World II next year. And it leads to civil wars and eventual revolutions in Europe as well. So here's what the printing press looks like. You would put ink over the letters that were laid out here and then literally press down to make an impression for each page. In the North, the two important authors to know are Erasmus, who was a religious philosopher who wrote satire. He used humor to critique society. And Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, which described a perfect society as a way to criticize the society that he lived in. Other people to know, playwrights, we have William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and we're going to look at a work each from Jan van Eyck and Peter Bruegel. So if you go back to your master's sheet, we have Giovanni Arnolfini and His Bride by Jan van Eyck. If you look, you can see some great detail here in this mirror. Look at these terribly uncomfortable shoes that they wore. Look at that dog. It's a lifelike dog. Then we have The Peasant's Dance by Bruegel. So this shows the peasants gathering in a medieval or Renaissance village. So let's take a moment to note some important comparisons between the Southern and Northern Renaissance. The Southern is so focused in Italy. It's more secular. It's about humanism. Much more advanced art, architecture, and sculpture. Frescoes are important. In Northern Europe, we have a more religious tone, a focus on humanism with like a side of Christianity. The art is not quite as realistic, not as quite as advanced, still more like the Middle Ages art, and they're doing oil paintings rather than frescoes. Okay, so big things to walk away with today. You need to understand what humanism is. Understand how the cities in Italy became wealthy, understand what art was like in the Renaissance, and know the four Italian masters, authors, and their works. The good news about the Renaissance artists is that you already know them because they are the Ninja Turtles. So we have Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo da Vinci. You know these guys. All right. Let's go ahead, and if you have any time left today, work on your SOL review packets. Thanks, guys.